Hello and welcome to the Short Gun Sportsman, a podcast about handgun hunting brought to you by Handgun Hunters International. My name is Ryan Hoover and I'm your host. I believe handgun hunting is the most rewarding way to hunt, and it's something I want to share with as many people as I can. If you are at all interested in getting your own game meat, I want to challenge you to a way of hunting that is good for both your spirit and your body, so you can become the confident, self-reliant person you were meant to be. Today's episode is really special and just so interesting. It's about some of the most famous handgun hunting cartridges of all time, the JDJ Cartridges. J.D. Jones developed these cartridges starting in the 70s with the intent to be able to take advantage of rifle bullets in single-shot handguns, mostly the Contenders. And these cartridges are well known. Cartridges like the 375 and 6.5 JDJ are well known and still popular handgun hunting rounds. Well, today I got to speak with Brian Alberts of SSK Firearms. Brian has been with them almost 40 years, coming up through the ranks to eventually now he is the manager of SSK Firearms. Brian has a wealth of knowledge. He knows so much about all of these cartridges and how they were developed and what they were developed for and all the little details about them. It was so fun for me as a former gunsmith to be able to pick his brain about them. And there's just great history here. Brian is also a stand-up guy, really nice, really generous with his knowledge and his time. And I'm super grateful that he took the time to do this interview with us today. And I know that we're going to be taking advantage of Brian Albert's wisdom as we go forward. But before we do, I'd like to invite everyone here that's listening to subscribe to our free digital magazine, The Six Gunner, which you can sign up for at subscribepage.com/The Six Gunner. This, again, is a free digital magazine that we put out as HHI. It is written exclusively by HHI members and contains all kinds of great information about experiences in the field, ways to do interesting loads for your gun. For instance, we had a really good article on shot shells. So many hunting stories and reviews of gear. And again, all by HHI members. So I invite you to subscribe today. Go to subscribepage.com/The Six Gunner. All right, here we go. I hope you enjoy my interview with Brian Alberts. Brian Alberts, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Glad to be here, Ron. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You were recommended to me as someone I needed to speak to about JDJ cartridges because of your good work at SSK Industries. How long have you worked at SSK?
I started work at SSK in 1984, and I continued to work for JD until the business was subsequently sold in 2018.
Okay. Did y'all stay in the same location?
Initially, we worked out of JD's house in the first few years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we worked out of his basement for probably the first 3 years that we were actually a full-fledged functioning company. He had done it as a side note until that point. Mm-hmm. And then we worked from his home for, like I said, approximately 3 years. At that point, we moved to a shop not far from his home in the town of Wintersville, Ohio, and we remained there for 32 years.
What is your role at SSK? What do you do?
So my current role is manager of SSK. My roles through the years have been varied. I've done probably every job there is to do here at SSK and still do a whole host of them.
Is your background just as kind of a machinist, gunsmith, tinkerer?
Machinist, mm-hmm. Yeah, machinist background, machinist and electrical, and then just a lifelong shooter, reloader. I actually met J.D. Jones when I was 16 years old. I was shooting at the local firing range, and he was kind of interested in what I was doing. Someone so young, I was shooting a Ruger M77 and 220 Swift with the inertial scope on it. And I had a whole group of hand loads that I was working through, and he just walked over and introduced himself.
Interesting. Was your background in firearms before you joined SSK?
Well, I have always been interested in firearms and had done a lot of shooting since I was very young. My father was always involved in shooting sports and hunting. So I'd been involved in it for a number of years before I started at SSK, but I did not have any sort of career in firearms until I started working for SSK.
So one of the most famous things about SSK, obviously, especially to us handgun hunters, are the line of JDJ cartridges, named after J.D. Jones, obviously. What kind of started the JDJ thing at SSK?
So just the need for better accuracy, better power, better performance out of handgun cartridges that were available at the time. They were generally lower powered and performance was not great, kind of subpar. Another issue with a lot of the early wildcats was that they were very difficult to form. Case life was poor. So we, just to create something that was easy for your basic reloader to make, something that had a very durable case, and of course something that was just top of the line performance.
Gotcha. So when you guys approached this, well, first, were you involved with the design of these as well as the production?
Later on, the early cartridges, no. JD first started the 6.5 and the 375, and I believe the first ringers were ordered in 1978.
Did you, when y'all were working on these JDJ cartridges, what were some of the benchmarks that you were, was it a velocity thing, a pressure thing, or, efficiency in short barrels? I mean, it's probably a little bit of all of the above, but what were y'all's benchmarks?
Well, right. And again, I think initially we were looking for something that increased the velocities over what was available at the time. We had a lot of rifle bullets that in those days were designed to work at a little bit higher velocities than any of the handgun stuff. So we wanted to come up with cartridges that would work with the good rifle bullets that were available. So we had velocity ranges in mind that we wanted to touch on, and to get these projectiles to work. Well, also when you do these things, those bullets are also the most accurate bullets. So it kind of went hand in hand.
So when you guys identified kind of a need, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of it was because you saw bullets that were designed to work in a certain velocity range, and you wanted to create a cartridge that could push a bullet to that velocity range from a handgun.
Right.
Yeah,
that's correct.
So when you identified kind of that bullet or that caliber, meaning 338, 30, whatever, what was your process from conception to testing?
So first of all, we would take a projectile. We would look at a certain group of projectiles or projectiles that through shooting various other calibers we felt that would be good candidates, that would work in the velocity range that we thought we could achieve in a Contender or a 14-inch barrel, which is predominantly what we work with in those days. Things have kind of gotten morphed into long lengths and some of this other stuff, but in those days it was a 14-inch Contender. So we would look at certain bullets and say, well, this bullet is a little soft. We did a lot of shooting, and JD had done a ton of shooting at a lot of game animals and a lot of live action shooting with various things, and kind of determine, hey, this projectile looks like this would work in this velocity range. So we would start looking at cartridge cases, and again, we hit on two of them that were really great. So the 225 Winchester and the 444 Marlin were two that, as cartridge cases, were just outstanding. I mean, they were rimmed. They were extremely durable cartridge cases. They were easy to form, and they offered great case life, very strong cartridge cases. We predominantly based a lot of the early ones on those two cartridge cases. So we would look at, all right, well, what do we have to do to get this cartridge? What do we have to do to form it? What's going to be required to form it? Are we going to need form dies? Are we not going to need form dies? So we would start, taking some cartridges and necking them to the prospective bore diameters. We would do that a host of different ways. I mean, we had a very substantial die collection, which allowed us
I imagine
to go, hundreds. So it was, we always could come up with something that would allow us to get in the ballpark on something. And then we would look at, how easy it was to form. Did we have to do anything unusual? What worked best? And we would kind of refine that a little bit. And again, with a lot of the stuff with those two cartridge cases, we kind of knew they would work pretty well. So we would, at that point, we would have a reamer made. We would contact our reamer manufacturer, who predominantly always was Dave Manson, who is Manson Precision now. But back in the day, Dave worked for Climber, so
right.
He was big behind a lot of the early stuff and then getting us good usable tooling. And Dave has always seemed to know what we were looking for. So we would provide Dave with some measurements on things, and we would get a reamer going, and then we would chamber barrel, form cases, work out what we needed to do to form them, and sort of those procedures. In the case of the 225, it was simply necking them up and fire forming them. So that was pretty straightforward. And then we would just work on developing the loads from that point on.
Man, as a not only a gun nut, but I call myself a recovering gun builder. Some of the questions I have: first, the 444 and the 225 case. What is it about those cases specifically that makes them so well suited for this?
Well, first and foremost, they were rimmed. They were rimmed, and that's a big deal in the Contender.
Right.
Rimless cases are okay, but they're not ideal. They're not ideal in a single shot. The strength, they were developed for, in the case of the 225, high pressure, into the 50,000s. 444, again, into the 50,000s, or the head was plenty strong enough to handle that sort of stuff. So we had cartridge cases that were very durable, that we knew would last, and guys would be able to reload them a long time. I have 225 cases that I've probably reloaded over 20 times.
Wow.
So that's a big benefit for the reloader. The cartridges cases last a long time, whereas, in the day, a lot of guys were shooting 30 Harrods, 357 Harrods, and it was very difficult to form the cases. Case life was generally poor, because 30-30 cases generally is not a high pressure case. Case life was generally poor with a lot of them, because you're necking them down, neck reaming, those sorts of things. So in the 225 and the 444, we just had a rim case that had really good capacity. Brass hardness was about right. They would form very easily, and they would hold up. The cartridge cases would last. JD has always told everybody, he says, "Hey, I'm a shooter. I'm not a bench rester. I don't want to spend time reloading. I want to be able to load my ammo and have these cases last a long time." And those two cartridge cases let us do that. 444 is another, same in a lot of ways, and that it's, I've had a lot of 444 cases and 375 JDJ and 309 and any of those JDJ Wildcats that last in excess of 20 firings.
Wow. That's a lot, especially for
it is a lot, and it's a lot. So that's, those are some of the parameters that we wanted that case life, and those were reasons we picked those cases, because they gave that to us.
So when you talk about easy to form, what are kind of the requirements for you saying this is an easy to form case?
So basically, the way we looked at it is, we didn't want a neck ream, no neck turning, no neck reaming, no crazy trimming, none of that stuff. Basically, just you could take, in the case of the 225, we just had the dies made with elliptical or tapered expanders. So one pass in the die, neck the case up to the correct caliber, and then loading it with a fire form load and firing it in the gun created the case. We didn't want to do a lot of crazy stuff with the cases. We wanted to get away from neck turning, neck reaming, cutting off of cartridge cases, expensive form dies. We wanted the cartridges to be made with very basic dies. All of the 225 base JDJs could just be necked up and fire formed. There was no special die required at all. 444 Marlin, from 416 down to 338, just run them in a die and they're done. 309 8mm required a fire form step, and when we looked at those two, we knew we could not form them with a 40-degree shoulder die set, so we looked at what was available. So we just looked at a 308 die in the case of the 309. You just take a 308 full-length sizer die and neck a 444 down to 30 cal and fire form. Most guys had access to a 308 die, so in the case we didn't have to have any kind of real expensive form die. We just tell a guy, "Hey, do you have a set of 308 dies?" "Yep." "Well, you have a form die for a 309. So we looked at it from that perspective. We didn't have a lot of elaborate, forming dies and forming procedures. Most were just neck downs or neck ups, and then shoot them in the barrel.
This has always been interesting to me, because I've never developed a Wildcat from scratch. What are like when you are saying, okay, I'm like, let's take the example you're just talking about. You're saying a 444 to a 309 JDJ.
Mhm.
Obviously, your dimension, the dimension that you're starting with is the bore diameter or the caliber of the bullet. So when you decide things like, length of rim to where the shoulder starts, the angle of the shoulder, how long the neck's going to be, the taper of the case, all that kind of thing, is that something that you guys just kind of had some standards on? I mean, because when you're going to get a reamer made, right, you kind of need to know those things. And so when you have a
Right.
reamer made, to me, I've always been curious about how do you know what you need without the reamer, but how do you get the reamer without knowing what you need?
Okay. Well, basically, we kind of knew what we wanted dimensionally. We wanted minimum dot. We wanted minimum dot body taper. We wanted a little bit, but minimum. And some of this we worked out along the way. This went from 1978, and then into the 80s we did from probably 84 into the early 90s we did a flurry of them. There was quite a number of them that we did,
Mm-hmm.
and so we knew what we kind of wanted. We wanted minimum body taper, 40-degree shoulder. Those were our requirements with that. So when you kind of know those numbers and you have a guy who's a good reamer maker, you work with him and you figure out those numbers because a lot of them tie together. So we would neck some cases down and we would see kind of where the neck came out, and we would do some measuring, and then we would look at, just basically looking at some numbers on some other cartridges or on neck length. How long do we want the neck? Do we want it this long, that long? We looked at the bullets that were available. Where do we want to seat that bullet? How are the cantilores on these bullets generally? Where do they sit if they have them? And how do we want this to sit in the case? So you make dummies up, you make dummy cartridges up, you neck some stuff down, like in the case of 309, you neck stuff down to 308, and you kind of take a look at that. You kind of look where you want the bullet to seat. Another thing we try to do with most of these cartridges, and that has to do with the length of the throat, is the bullets that we wanted to focus on, we wanted to basically be able to seat base of bullet even with the base of the neck.
Mm.
So we would look at some of these bullets and their lengths. And again, we would put together some dummies and we would just figure out, with calipers and measuring and a little bit of dead reckoning and previous experience, where we wanted that to be. And we would come up kind of with numbers like that. It was, there were no computers that you plug numbers into and it gave you some sort of magical formula.
Right.
It was just a lot of basically bench work, a lot of bench work. You sit there and again, make up dummies and take a host of bullets that you wanted to work in this thing, and you would just lay the thing out, and you would write down measurements. And in those days, we had a blank reamer page where you could fill out the numbers that you want, and we would just work the numbers until we kind of got it where we wanted it. We would submit it to the reamer maker, and he would say, "All right, well, this is going to give you this, or this is, we could do this. This is going to be a little bit better," and you kind of work with him a little bit. And pretty soon you come up with a reamer. You come up with dimensions that he can make a reamer from.
How many
And we
times?
generally never missed it by very much. I mean, most of the time it was easy to figure out neck thickness. Once you necked one down, you could figure that all out.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a lot of, there were lots of other cartridges that were similar. You kind of looked at what was out there and what was available. The neck thickness was something that was fairly simple to figure out. But generally, the things we would change or have to change, generally very slight. We would sometimes tweak the throats a little bit. We've always kept the throats of our reamers within a thou bullet diameter so that the long throats are not a problem if the bullet's not rattling down it.
Right.
So we always kept the throats within a thou bullet diameter. And a good example was our 6.5 JDJ. I mean, it shoots as well with an 85 grain bullet as it does with a 140. Those were things that we like to do, and we did with these cartridges.
That was a question I was going to ask you about throat length and diameter. And for people listening who don't know what that is, that's the section of the chamber that's directly in front of the neck. It basically is a very slight funnel that guides the bullet into the rifle and eases it into the rifling. So with when you guys were deciding that, because, like I said, I used to build guns, and, there would be a caliber, the 6.5 Creedmoor is a great example of this, where you buy a Sammy spec reamer. Well, a lot of loaded ammunition doesn't fit in that because they want to load those bullets long. So when you guys were developing these cartridges, rather, Did you err on the side of being able to have a longer throat?
Yes.
Okay.
In most cases, yes, absolutely, we did. And then we looked at what bullets we felt would be the most used the most and the weights that would be most commonly used.
Mm-hmm.
I'll use the 6.5 as an example because it's by far, probably in the 375, the two most successful.
Mm-hmm.
But we looked at bullets like the 120 grain spear and later the 120 grain Nosler. But the original 6.5 was kind of set up with a 120 grain spear, seated base of bullet, even with the base of the neck in terms of throat. And later we kind of tweaked that a little bit when the Nosler came out, the 120 grain Nosler ballistic tip. We would seat it base of the bow tail, even with the base of the neck. So that was kind of where we went with on the throats for those. We just seated some bullets that we felt we were going to use the most, and kind of came up with it from there, and through making dummy cartridges and measuring and those sorts of things, and a little bit of trial and error once they were done.
Sure. How concerned were you guys with neck tension and how neck length related to that?
So we worked with what we had. In the case of the 444, we can make the necks a little bit longer. In the case of the 225, the neck is shorter, just simply because that's how we kind of came up with the powder capacity we wanted. It ended up with a little bit shorter neck. It's at least a caliber, the neck is a caliber long, which was our minimum. We thought if it was that way, it was okay. And we've never had any issue
Right.
to the contrary. So we looked at the cartridge case, the 444, and the capacity let us go with a little bit longer neck on those. But we didn't want to really go too crazy on it. We wanted lots of powder space. So, we probably pushed the necks towards being maybe a tad shorter in some cases, but not always.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes, obviously you don't have the requirement of bullets staying in place in a magazine. So,
right.
That takes a lot, but I'm sure it's, this is a highly technical detail that I'm just curious about. I know that it's probably not as big a deal, in the overall scheme of things. So were all the JDJ cartridges developed for the Contender?
No. I mean, all the early ones were.
Right.
All the ones in the early days were all developed for the Contender. But we did have a whole host of cartridges that we developed for the XP100.
Oh, yes. Right.
This was in the days before the Encore was available. So we also built a large number of XP. Doc has a number of them. Doc Rogers has a number of them that we built. I know. And so we also did a lot of work with the XP100, and we developed cartridges, bigger bore cartridges for the XP. We kind of felt that, the stuff, anything under 375 had really been done a lot. So we didn't do a lot of work with those, but stuff larger than 375, we did a host of wildcats based on the 350 Magnum case. We did probably, I think, 4 based on that. There was a 411 and a 416 whammy that we did for the XP100. The early stuff was really Contender focused, with some XP stuff thrown in there as well.
That's true. And, I don't think about the XPs as much as I think about the Contenders, because you guys are, like you said, the 6.5 and the 375, probably the ones you're best known for. But, in the XP100, you have a lot broader range as far as strength of the action.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We had a huge range in the XP, and we build XPs and everything. We developed some very large XPs, 50 cal XPs, 12.9 by 50.8 and bigger that we did in the XP100. And then we did everything in between. I mean, a lot of we have close to 500 reamers. So
wow.
Not all of those are Contender cartridges. So we did a lot of work with the XP. We did a lot of XP 100s in the late 80s and early 90s. You rarely see one now, but it was very popular for handgun hunting, especially guys who wanted to really extend the range and increase the power for handgun hunting. And the XP was the obvious choice. It was just readily available. It was a very extremely accurate gun. It was a good gun for that purpose. It lended itself well to customization. We just did a lot of work with that.
I wish it was still readily available.
Yes. Yeah.
So the Contender, though, I want to talk about that for a minute. What are the limits of the Contender that you guys worked on? Because, a lot of people, there's a lot of information out there, some of it keyboard warrioring, but, people will say, okay, well, the operating pressure of a 223 or whatever is what, 55,000, I think, or something like that. But that's okay to put in a Contender. Why isn't it okay to put something that operates at that pressure that's a larger caliber in the Contender? What are the limits of that platform?
So that's an easy one in terms of physical size.
Mm-hmm.
The case head thrust, is with a 223 is very small, very small. So you've got a very small head size, so you can get away with that in most anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to overwhelm the Contender, just due to the fact that the cartridge case head size is small and the case head thrust on the frames is pretty light. Now you could go, and again, a lot of this was trial and error. I mean, we kind of knew where everything was at. If you especially with the low development, we did a ton of shooting. I mean, we wore out a lot of Contenders. I don't know too many people have worn out as many Contenders as we have, and worn out barrels and all this stuff. I mean, I have couple of the very early ones, and I mean, they had thousands of barrels on them, let alone rounds. I don't even know. So we just hung them up. So I mean, you would see trends. That's one of the reasons you do a lot of test shooting with things that, powders you want to use and bullets you want to use. You do a lot of test shooting, and it becomes apparent where you can be with the gun. You're going to start running into problems with gun life pretty quick with some of these things. We just based a lot of that on shooting and test work. Hey, we've shot this a bunch. We've shot thousands and thousands of rounds through the gun. The gun holds up well. The durability is good. We're not seeing accelerated wear with the gun. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it was based on that. Of course, we saw some stuff that we didn't do, or we tried, or we tested, and I said, hey, the gun isn't going to take that. So, and again, people also have trouble with understanding the difference between blowing a gun up and damaging the gun. Blowing a gun up is a detonation. Generally, right. What happens in the case of overpressuring a Contender is it's going to stretch. It's going to stretch, and then it's going to pop open. When the original Contenders, when they popped open, that is a problem. The gun's got something wrong with it. Stop shooting immediately. Don't continue. And in the day when Thompson Center was around, what you did was you sent it back to them, and the guns had a lifetime warranty on them, and they'd just replace it with a new one. They'd check it. They put it on their frame gauges, and they would replace it. We used to get a lot of calls from guys, and said, hey, my gun came open and all this. And, I said, hey, your gun is damaged. Your barrel or your gun is damaged, one or the other. Mm-hmm. Stop shooting it. I said, think about this. What would you think if your bolt action rifle flew open?
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
Right.
That's what's happening. You would stop shooting it immediately. So that's the same with the Contender.
That makes sense. So the biggest indicator of a failure would be the frame stretching. I mean, like the most common, not the biggest. The most
common was stretched frames. Mm-hmm. You can see the stretch if you hold this frame up in the light and look down the side of it. Mm-hmm. Right where the standing breech starts, they would stretch, mm-hmm. and that would be the first indication. And then you would have, locking shelf issues. Normally when they come open, the locking shelf chipped. The bolt chips the locking shelf. Normally when that happened, the frame was not repairable. Now, there were cases, where the locking shelf could just be worn out, and TC developed ways to repair that. And a lot of cases, mm-hmm. They would beam weld a new hardened insert in there and repair the frame if it wasn't stretched.
Right.
But later on, they got away from doing that, and they just pretty much replaced them most of the time.
So I want to go back real quick to something you said that you're right is an easy one that I think a lot of people have a misconception about, or especially a lot of people who haven't had a lot of experience with this platform, is the difference between case thrust and just overall operating pressure. And I always like to think of it as a difference like between poking your finger on something and punching something. The bigger surface area of a large case is going to, by definition, push harder at the same pressure.
So, and again, that works the same way in reverse with the 4570. We mm-hmm. used to get a lot of calls. How can you put a 4570 in the Contender? I said, mm-hmm. It works at shotgun pressures.
Right. Yeah.
So you could put that big case in there, and it works at mild pressures compared to rifles.
Right.
Any modern rifle. in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that was easily manageable by the Contender frame. So there's a little bit of a disconnect with some folks about physical size and actually what it's doing to the gun. They're not necessarily connected.
Right. And then that's further reinforced by the fact that shooting a 223 14-inch Contender and shooting an unbraked 4570 14-inch Contender is a very different experience.
Yeah, tremendously different
You know,
experience.
and
Yeah.
so that can lead people to have a misconception about power.
Yes, tremendously different. I can't even tell you how many phone calls used to take over guys the first time. We were the first company to do the 4570 in the Contender,
Mm-hmm.
and the factory was a little leery of it, not necessarily because it did anything with the gun, but this was the early guns. You had wood grips and all these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of things, and we were putting Pachmeyer grips on these guns. We were putting Magnapour our muzzle brakes on them. So we were doing things a little bit differently. We had developed our own scope base, so the scopes weren't going to fly off and hit you in the head. So, but I talked to a lot of guys with their first experience shooting a 4570 in a Contender, and generally it was much different than their normal kind of encounter with their 44 mag or whatever they had at the time.
Right. Did they call you, say, hey, you want to buy a barrel?
Well, it's funny. We rarely got that. Matter of fact, guys were like, man, this thing is really a handful, but man, does it shoot. And, that was a universal comment. He says, I can hold it. Man, you can hit anything with it. And I said, well, yeah, that's right. That's kind of why we like it. So that was more likely, more the comment that you got than anybody saying, hey, holy cow, I got to get rid of it. It's going to knock my head off.
Yeah. What the 4570 brought to mind something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, because when I had a shop, a lot of what I did was old Winchester and Winchester replicas and sharps and high walls, low walls, etc. And so I really became fascinated by the quote unquote Buffalo cartridges. And I know that you guys have stuffed some of those cartridges into the Contender and Encore platform. What, like the 5070 Government, I've even seen, I think it was probably an Encore platform, the 5095 Sharps, things like that. This is purely self-serving because I'm curious about it, but what have y'all done with those older late 19th century cartridges? And I imagine they're a hoot to shoot, but what have y'all done with those?
So we've been messing with those for quite a long time. When Thompson Center brought out the TCR rifle, we started making barrels for that, and we really kind of went after those cartridges. We started doing all the Nitro Express cartridges in the TCR, and of course a lot of the Sharps cartridges, 5070, 5090, 5110, 5140 to name a couple. And then we had a whole host of 45s. I think reamers go up to, I've got a 45 120 reamer. So we would do a whole host of those cartridges in the TCR in the early days. So the 50 cals we didn't like to do in the Contender. The 5070 is all right pressure wise in the Contender, but the problem you have when you go 50 cal in the Contender is you got to mount the scope down the barrel a little ways because the chamber gets pretty thin and you don't have enough hole depth to put good screw holes in. So we kind of got away from doing those just because the guns were iron sight guns only a lot of times, and that's not what really guys wanted to do. Guys wanted to put scopes on them. So when the Encore came out, that let us put all these things into the same kind of gun. The TCR obviously was discontinued, and after the fire at TC, it never came back. So when the Contender came out, or the Encore came out, we started doing all these cartridges in the Encore. And we go up to 500 Nitro, 500 5140 Sharps is what we go up to in the Encore.
Man, I think it was about the 900 JDJ, but it's something that I read for him a long time that he liked to shoot, or shooting tracers were like flaming basketballs.
Yeah, so that was extremely popular Encore barrel that we still do. We still offer, do a number of them. Is a 50 Alaskan with a fast twist, a 1-9 twist to shoot 50 BMG projectiles. And we also do that in a 5140 Sharps. You can do the same thing with it. You just put a fast twist in the Sharps and you shoot 50 BMG projectiles in it. And, there was a time when that stuff was fairly cheap and readily available.
Right.
And, if you have access to those projectiles, they're a blast to shoot. They're generally pretty darn accurate, and man, they trace a long way.
Yeah,
They trace a long way.
I imagine that image has stuck with me, not necessarily always for the flaming aspect, but shooting big, heavy lead bullets at slower velocities where you have time to take a sip of your coffee before it hits the target is kind of kind of a fun idea. I don't know, practicality, but who cares about practicality?
Well, right, and that was our thought on all that. I mean, it's not practical, which is kind of why we did it.
Right? Yeah.
Guys had a blast doing it. We always had a blast shooting them, and they sold well. I mean, guys enjoyed them. We still get a lot of comments from guys about, hey, I have one of these guns and shoot this all the time, and we have a blast with it. So as long as you're doing it in the rainy season, you're okay.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, so back off of my personal interest into back to the JDJ. You mentioned rather the 6.5 and the 375 being the most successful JDJs.
Right.
Why do you think those two particular are the most successful?
Those two are so enduring for a host of reasons. I think all the 225 based cartridges are really great. They are just such game getters. It's just amazing. But the 6.5 is just from day one was just absolutely lethal on stuff. I mean, it was accurate, super accurate, low recoil. And I mean, just the bullets in 6.5, just phenomenal performance on game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just way beyond its size. I mean, I think JD's first trip, he shot a zebra with the 6.5 and poleaxed it, put it right down. So yeah. I think that the things we spoke about earlier, the cases last a long time. They're pretty easy to form. They are accurate. And that's another thing that I think that the JDJs have, in that you don't have to use bench rest techniques. We constantly get, guys wanting to, I said, you can do whatever you want. I said, but we set them up so you don't need to. We rarely trimmed anything. We rarely trimmed anything. I mean, we didn't get into a lot of any of these advanced loading techniques. We could have, we did sometimes when we needed to, but I mean, these cartridges don't require that. I mean, a guy can load these things up. The Fireform loads are phenomenally accurate. I mean, you can go out and hunt with the Fireform loads, and I know a lot of guys deer hunt with the Fireform loads. They are very accurate. So I think that the cartridges are very accurate, and they are just great game getters. Mm-hmm. And same with the 375. The 375 is extremely well known. I think in 84, 85, it took a whole host of elephants. I don't remember the exact number of it, but it was over a dozen. Mm-hmm. So very good terminal performance. You had very good 375 bullets. The cartridge is manageable, more manageable than the 4570. It gives you greater range. It's a 250-yard gun, and it's just terminal performance on game is just outstanding, and couldn't be easier to make. One pass on the full-length sizing die forms the case, and that's it. You're ready to go. There's no fire forming with it. So just accuracy, power, and just longevity of cases, and just ease of reloading. I think those points all hit very, very, very well with those cartridges, and that's why their popularity is so enduring.
Yeah, and I mean, just thinking about from when I was a kid, getting into all this stuff, a fully ribbed Contender with Packmeyer grips, a TSOB mount, and a scope is in 375 is probably one of the top 5 most iconic hunting handguns of all time.
Absolutely, without a doubt. It's funny when I think about that, how many of those I saw go out the door, how many put together. It's just tons of them. And even to this day, we do that. We've had some pictures on our Facebook page of that gun, and some of the advertising we did always featured the full length vent rib on the Contender and 14-inch Contender. So yes, very iconic gun. Sold just, I don't even know how many of them. It was extremely popular and still is to this day. I mean, it's still a very popular caliber.
Yeah.
It's one of those, as you said, very iconic gun.
So what are some of the JDJ cartridges that probably have really good performance, maybe not equaling the 6.5, which seems to be kind of like the golden child,
Right.
that
So
maybe have
so
flown under the radar?
so any of the 225 based Wildcats,
Uh-huh.
we go from 22, the 226, the 226. There's a six number two. There's a 257. Of course, the 6.5, and there's also a 7 millimeter and a
Mm-hmm.
270. So we kind of went with that cartridge case clear up to 7 millimeter. And 257 is just a stellar performer. Very, very close to the 6.5. I mean, it on deer and antelope. I mean, wow, it just zaps them. So the 257 was always very good, but any of them were very good performers within given bullet weights available. 270, there's a host of good ones. 7 millimeters, a host of really good ones that work well. And you get the same performance out of all the cases, no matter what size you get. I mean, you get outstanding case life, ease of forming, accuracy, and all those with all of them. I think 6.5 has always been one of JD's favorite bore diameters. In a lot of his trips, he favored it, and it took off. As the most popular, and justifiably so. It was an outstanding performer, but like I said, the two larger brothers of the 6.5, the 270 and the 7 millimeter, also again very good performers with certain bullets. And in many ways mirror what the 6.5 does.
That's good to hear. So are there any JDJ cartridges or things that you guys worked on that you got to completion and then they didn't actually work as well as you had hoped?
Well, there are always some. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are always some that didn't, and now not necessarily because we didn't think that they were good. The 8 millimeter JDJ and the 9.3 JDJ were two that just never hit off well here in America.
Yeah.
The two metric bores that we did, even though they had very good bullets. I mean, there's a lot of really good 8 millimeter bullets that work well in the 8 millimeter JDJ. But you're going up against the 30 cal in America, and
Right.
they don't go head to head well because everybody's got 30 cal bullets, 30 cal rifles, and that's always been a mainstay in the United States. So the 8 millimeter and the 9.3 JDJ, which is a 366, it's European version of the 375. There were a whole host of good bullets available, but they were more expensive foreign bullets, RWS and those sorts of things. Those cartridges, while I felt they were very good cartridges, just never took a real hold, mainly because of their the metric designation.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So today, being still involved hot and heavy at SSK Firearms, how popular are the JDJ cartridges today?
So the 444 based cartridges are good, do well. The 225 based cartridges would do well if Winchester would run us some 225 brass.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it has not been available in around 15 years. We have been looking. We've looked at what's available. There are some companies making some of that, and just what's available brass-wise right now is not acceptable. So, hopefully here when we get the new receiver out and available and we get kind of that under our belt, we'll focus a little more on possibly getting some 225 Winchester brass available again.
Gotcha.
At least that's what I'd like to see us do. But the JDJs still do very well. The 6.5 and the 375 are the best selling dies still. So they still do very well.
That's good to know. That's good to hear because they are great. I want to talk to you offline about that a little bit as well with the brass and et cetera. But that kind of answers my last question about the future of JDJ cartridges as far as remaining available. But I mean, I know a large part of that's going to depend on components being available. But I know that SSK is going to keep making them as long as they can, and I know that handgun hunters, we proselytize about about some of those calibers for sure. So I'm excited, and it's really good to hear how you guys are, kind of holding down the fort on this front?
Well, that was all part of the deal when SSK was purchased from JD, the new owners.
Mm-hmm.
I told them, hey, all the SSK baggage comes with me. So, all the stuff that we do and that we are known to do and that we've done well, that stuff is first and foremost in my mind. And, getting away from that is just too far. Is not going to be very acceptable to me, because that stuff works. It's proven. It's been proven all over the world. It's been tested in all the game fields there are, and it works. So those are winning combinations. So you can't steer away from that and still be SSK. As long as I'm here, we're going to focus up and make sure that all that stuff continues to go that way, and that we continue to offer those cartridges, and we continue to put out that iconic hand cannon that everybody associates with us.
Yeah.
Into the future.
That's great. Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast today and just giving us your time. You are a wealth of information and a heck of a guest. I know people are going to love this one. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Wow. I really enjoyed that one. That one was so amazing. And Brian, what a nice guy, what an expert in his field, and just I could have talked with him for hours about all that stuff. I'm really grateful to him. I know that we'll do another one with him sometime in the future. He is just working hard to guard the mission of SSK, keep them primarily focused on what SSK does well, and that is pretty much innovate, I guess it would be my description of it. I've followed them since I was a youngster, and it's really cool to see them moving into the future, even with their new ownership, just cranking out good stuff. I know that handgun hunters have a good partner in SSK Firearms moving forward, especially with Brian Alberts at the helm there as their manager. Thanks again to Brian for giving his time to do this and for all the information he's shared with me offline as well. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. This podcast is produced by Handgun Hunters International. HHI is the only organization dedicated solely to supporting and growing the sport of handgun hunting. Membership gets you access to our great, well-moderated forum where friendly handgun hunters of all experience levels share stories and information from folks that have actual experience in our sport. We also host giveaways to our members of guns, gear, and ammo every month, and each prize is worth several times what membership costs. In addition to this podcast, we publish a free digital magazine, The Six Gunner, which is written exclusively by HHI members. If you are a handgun hunter or support handgun hunting in any way, you need to be a member of HHI. Join today at handgunhuntersinternational.com. Again, if you have any questions on how to get started in handgun hunting, please reach out to me at ryan@handgunhuntersinternational.com. If you think we deserve it, please leave us a 5-star review, and don't forget to follow Handgun Hunters International on social media at Handgun Hunters INT. God bless and good hunting.